I hate our neighborhood block parties. Every summer, without fail, my wife Patricia found a reason to host one, or volunteer us to co-host one, at our place on Clearwater Drive. She'd spent 2 weeks beforehand buying new outdoor furniture we didn't need, ordering catering we couldn't justify, and rehearsing conversations she planned to have with people I barely knew. For Patricia, these gatherings weren't about community. They were performances, and I was always the prop she forgot to account for. We had been married for 19 years. I was 52, a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Seattle, decent at my job, decent at most things. Patricia was 48 and ran a high-end day spa called Luminos on the east side of Bellevue. It was successful, genuinely successful, and she'd built it herself, which I respected. What I didn't respect anymore was the person she had become since it took off. Somewhere around year 11 or 12, my wife stopped being a partner and started being a brand. Everything she did was curated. Everything she said was positioned, including our marriage. We didn't fight. We didn't really talk either. We coexisted inside a beautiful house with expensive furniture and a security system I'd installed the previous fall after a string of break-ins in the area. 4 cameras. Front door, back door, driveway, and one covering the main living area inside. Her idea, actually. She'd been worried about the cleaning crew. I thought that was a little paranoid at the time. I set it up anyway. The block party that August was like every other one. I stood near the grill, nodded at the right moments, refilled my drink twice, and watched Patricia work the crowd like a politician at a fundraiser. Her business partner Marcus was there, tall, mid-40s, good-looking in the way men are when they've spent money on it. He ran the financial side of the Minos and had been around for about 3 years. I'd never had a problem with him. He was professional, polite, kept a respectful distance. That night, watching them move through the backyard together, I noticed something I couldn't fully name. Not a touch or a look, more of a rhythm. The way two people move when they've stopped being careful around each other. I told myself I was tired. I flew to Portland 2 days later for a week-long project review. Nothing unusual. I called home Tuesday night and Patricia didn't answer. I left a message. She texted back around 11, "Sorry, long day, call you tomorrow," and that was that. I got back to Seattle on Friday evening. Patricia's car was in the driveway. I let myself in through the garage, set my bag down, and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The house was quiet. She was upstairs, I assumed, probably on a call or asleep early. I don't know what made me check the security footage that night. I'd done it before when I'd heard odd sounds at the perimeter. This time, there wasn't a specific reason. I was just tired and restless, and my laptop was sitting right there on the kitchen counter. I pulled up Tuesday. I watched my wife walk through our front door at 6:43 in the evening. Marcus was with her. I watched them go upstairs. I watched him leave at 9:51. I watched my wife come back downstairs alone, pour a glass of wine, and sit on our couch with her phone. I sat at the kitchen counter for a long time. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't pour myself anything. I just sat there in the quiet of a house I'd paid for and thought about what I was going to do. The answer that came to me was, nothing. Not yet. Not like this. I closed the laptop. I carried my bag upstairs. My wife was asleep. I got in on my side of the bed, lay on my back, and stared at the ceiling until around 3 in the morning. Then I slept. The next 2 weeks I acted like nothing had happened. I came home at normal times. I had dinner with her, I asked about Luminos, and she told me about Luminos, and I listened in the careful way I'd been listening for years, just enough engagement to pass as present. She didn't notice any difference. That told me something. I made a few phone calls on my lunch breaks. The first was to a friend named Gary, a family attorney I'd known since grad school, who'd been through his own divorce 6 years prior and came out the other side wiser for it. I didn't tell him everything over the phone, I just said I needed to meet. Gary heard me out over coffee without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his cup and said, "You want to do this right, or do you want to do this fast?" I told him I want to do it right or do this fast. I told him I wanted to do it right. He said, "Then we have time to be thorough, and we should use it." He pulled out a notepad and we started making a list. The second call was to a private investigator named Ruth, who Gary had recommended. Compact woman, early 60s, hair cut short, handshake like a contractor. She specialized in domestic cases and charged a fair rate. I gave her access to the security system's cloud backup and a login to the home network. She would take it from there. Over the following 3 weeks, Ruth documented 11 separate occasions when Marcus visited the house while I was at work or traveling. She followed Patricia on 4 occasions. She obtained records I won't fully describe here except to say they were thorough and they were useful, and by the end of it, I understood I had not been imagining things for the past several years. What I hadn't anticipated was what Ruth found when she started looking at Luminos itself. She came to my office on a Thursday morning and closed the door and set a folder on my desk. She said, "Before I show you this, I want to be clear this is outside the original scope of what you hired me for, but I think you need to see it." I told her to go ahead. The spa had a clause in its founding partnership agreement, the one Patricia and Marcus had signed when he came on board 3 years ago, that explicitly prohibited romantic or personal relationships between partners. It was a standard protective clause, the kind lawyers put in when two people go into business together and want to preserve their professional structure in case things go sideways personally. They had violated it, in writing, essentially because Ruth had found a series of emails sent from a personal account Marcus used for non-business correspondence that made the timeline and nature of the relationship explicit. Dates, locations, details I won't repeat. What mattered was that these emails predated the clause being signed. He'd been advised to include the clause by the company attorney. He'd signed it knowing it was already being violated. Ruth said, "I don't know what you want to do with this, but the business attorney I consulted informally said it could be grounds for a forced buyout or dissolution." I thanked her. I asked her to send me a clean copy of everything on an encrypted drive. She said it would be on my desk by end of day. I called Gary that afternoon. I said, "It just got more complicated." He said, "Complicated for who?" I said, "For her." He was quiet for a second and then said, "Come in tomorrow morning, first thing. Here's the thing about a marriage that's been running on empty for years. When you finally decide to stop pretending, the practical pieces fall into place with an efficiency that surprises you." Gary was methodical. He walked me through the financial picture first. We had a joint account, 2 separate investment accounts in my name only, a retirement fund, equity in the house, and my stake in the engineering firm, which was sizable. Patricia had her own accounts and her equity in Luminos, which Gary said we'd need a business valuation on. I had already started moving some things. I want to be clear that everything I did was legal and documented because I was careful from the beginning to not give anyone a reason to accuse me of acting in bad faith. I transferred a portion of my personal investments into a separate account I set up at a bank across town. Not hiding it, Gary knew about every transaction and recorded them in our case file. But I was not going to sit still while this played out over months. I also did one more thing that week. Patricia had a standing Thursday evening with her girlfriends. Dinner and drinks, home by 11. Reliable as a train schedule. I used that window to go to Luminos. The front desk recognized me as the owner's husband and let me in without an appointment. I asked to speak with Marcus. The receptionist told me he was in a meeting. I said I'd wait. I sat in one of the lobby chairs and read a magazine about sustainable architecture for 20 minutes until Marcus came out. He looked at me the way people look at things they've been hoping to avoid. He recovered quickly. Said it was good to see me. Said we should go to his office. I followed him. I sat down across from his desk and I said, "I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to leave. I know. I have documentation. My attorney has copies of everything, including the emails from your personal account and a copy of the partnership agreement. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you that what happens next is going to be decided by attorneys, not by us in a parking lot somewhere. If you do anything to interfere with that process or to warn Patricia before she's served, I'll make sure your wife finds out the specific timeline before anything else happens. Do you understand me?" Marcus was a man who was used to being the smartest person in the room in business settings. He looked at me across his desk, and I watched him understand that he wasn't, today. He said he understood. I stood up and left. I stopped at the front desk on the way out and complimented the receptionist on the lobby renovation. Then I got in my car and drove to a diner on the east side and ate a club sandwich and drank 2 cups of coffee and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like myself. Patricia was served the following Monday morning. I moved into an extended stay hotel in Bellevue the night before, the kind that has a small kitchen and a gym and room service until midnight. I took my personal documents, my laptop, 2 weeks of clothes, and the encrypted drive. I left everything else. Gary told me she called his office 6 times the first day. He didn't take the calls. Her attorney, a sharp woman from a firm downtown, exactly who you'd expect Patricia to hire, reached out within 48 hours and signaled that her client was ready to negotiate. Gary said that usually meant they'd seen the documentation and decided fighting wasn't worth it. What I hadn't fully prepared for was the response from Marcus's wife, Diane. She called me directly. Somehow, I still don't know how she got my new number. About 10 days after the papers were served. She was calm in the way people are calm when they've already finished crying and moved on to something colder. She thanked me for the information. I told her I hadn't sent her anything intentionally, but that I wasn't going to apologize for the truth surfacing. She said she understood. She said she'd already spoken to her own attorney about the partnership agreement. I asked if she was all right. She laughed, just once, and said, "I'll be fine. I've been suspicious for over a year." Then she asked me a question I didn't expect. "Did you know?" And I told her the honest answer, which was that I had a feeling I kept talking myself out of. She said, "Me too." We stayed on the phone in silence for a few seconds, and then she said goodbye. Over the following months, the legal process moved the way legal processes do, slowly, with occasional sharp turns. The business valuation of Luminos came back, and it was substantial. Because Marcus had violated the partnership agreement, his negotiating position was weak. Diane's attorney was aggressive. The result was that Marcus was bought out of the partnership at a reduced rate. Patricia retained ownership of Luminos, but the buyout terms took a significant amount of liquidity out of her position. The divorce settlement was fair in the clinical sense of the word. We had been married long enough and earned enough separately that there wasn't a dramatic winner. Gary was thorough and steady throughout. I signed the final papers on a Tuesday afternoon in his conference room and drove back to the hotel and ordered room service and watched a documentary about railway systems in Japan. I felt fine. Not happy exactly. Not the way people describe feeling after endings like this. Just clear, like a window after rain. There's a detail I skipped over, and I should go back to it. In the middle of all of this, sometime in that first month, when I was still staying at the hotel and the legal side was just gaining momentum, I met a woman named Carol. She wasn't dramatic about it. I was sitting at the counter of a breakfast place near my hotel one morning, the kind of place with bad lighting and good coffee and laminated menus, and she sat 2 stools down from me and we both reached for the hot sauce at the same time. She apologized. I said there was enough for both of us. We ended up talking for 45 minutes. Carol was 50, recently retired from a career in hospital administration, in the middle of her own quiet reconstruction after a marriage that had ended 2 years prior. She was funny in a dry, unperformative way. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She didn't talk about herself as if she were pitching something. We had breakfast again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. At some point, it stopped being a coincidence that we were both at the same place at the same time, and we acknowledged that without making a bigger deal of it than it needed to be. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I was mid-divorce, mid-transition, still figuring out what the next version of my life was supposed to look like. But there was something uncomplicated about being around Carol that I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten it was an option. She didn't need me to perform. She didn't need me to be anything other than exactly what I was, which was a tired man eating scrambled eggs who was starting over at 52. She knew the broad outline of my situation. I knew hers. We didn't rush anything. We went to a jazz show in Capitol Hill one evening in October. We took a weekend drive up to the San Juans in November. Slow, like the season. I need to address the part that people always want to know about when they hear a story like this. The part about whether Patricia ever really understood what she'd done. Not legally. Not practically. But genuinely. I saw her once after the divorce was finalized. Completely unplanned. I was at a hardware store in Kirkland and she was in the parking lot getting into her car. We noticed each other at the same moment. There was nowhere to redirect. We walked toward each other by some instinct and stopped about 6 feet apart. She looked well. She always looked well. That was never the problem. She said, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "I should have been better to you." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more honest than an apology, which is just an acknowledgement that the facts were what they were. I said, "I should have said something earlier." Both of us waited too long. She nodded. We stood there for another second and then we both moved on. That's the ending that doesn't fit neatly into a story about revenge and consequences. But it's the one I have. I don't hate Patricia. I don't wish her harm. Luminos is still open and by all accounts doing well. She and Marcus no longer work together, which I understand has been an adjustment for the business. But she's managed it. She is a capable woman. I just wasn't the right person to be married to her, and she wasn't the right person to be married to me, and we both spent about a decade not saying that out loud. The house on Clearwater Drive sold in March. We split the equity, and I put my half into a smaller place in Fremont, 2 bedrooms close to the water, with a yard just large enough to be enjoyable without becoming a project. Carol has been over for dinner several times. She helped me pick out a dining table, which is not a small thing, It meant she was thinking about staying a while. I still have the security system. 4 cameras, same as before. Front door, back door, driveway, and one inside, covering the main room. I keep the inside one aimed at the front hallway now, mostly have it. I check it occasionally, the way you check a lock you've already secured, not because you're afraid, but because it was the small, careful act that changed everything, and some habits are worth keeping. Gary asked me once, somewhere in the middle of the legal proceedings, what I would have done differently. I thought about it seriously. I said I would have said something to Patricia years earlier when I first felt the marriage going quiet in the way it did. I would have sat across from her at the kitchen table and said I don't think either of us is happy, and I'd like to try to fix that, and maybe we would have fixed it, or maybe we would have ended it then, cleanly, with less wreckage on all sides. He said, most people say the same thing. I said I believe that. He said, does it help? I said, honestly, not very much. But knowing it is better than not knowing it, and that's usually the best you can do. Carol and I drove up to Whidbey Island last month. We rented a small cabin near the water and made dinner 2 nights in a row, and walked along the beach in the morning with coffee and paper cups and didn't talk very much because we didn't need to. On the second evening, we sat on the cabin porch and watched the water go dark, and she said, out of nowhere, I feel like myself again. And I said, me too. And I meant it completely. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. I've thought a lot about the moment I sat at that kitchen counter with my laptop open, watching a video I couldn't unsee. I've thought about what I did next, which was close the laptop, go upstairs, and say nothing. Some people hear that part and think I was weak. I don't see it that way anymore. Choosing not to react in the moment was the first real decision I made for myself in years. Everything that came after it followed from that one quiet choice. What happened to Patricia wasn't something I did to her. It was a result of decisions she made, compounded over time, that eventually ran out of room to hide. She violated a legal agreement she had signed with full knowledge of what it said. She brought another man into a life that was built on my income, my trust, and 19 years of my presence. Those weren't small things. And the consequence wasn't something I manufactured, it was already embedded in what she had done. I just made sure it wasn't buried. That's what I mean when I say there's a logic to the way things unfold. Not luck. Not fate in any mystical sense. Just the straightforward reality that actions accumulate, and eventually the weight of them lands somewhere. Patricia counted on my silence, and I had given her enough of it over the years that it was a reasonable bet. What she didn't account for was the version of me that finally stopped being silent. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I think about the men I came across in this process. The ones who had also been tangled up in her choices, whose lives had been redirected by someone else's recklessness. There was a cost to their silence too, and it wasn't a small one. I'm not saying anyone in that situation is blameless, but I understand now how easy it is to stay quiet when the alternative feels too complicated and the disruption feels too large. I stayed quiet for years for the same reason. It never protected me. It just delayed the reckoning. What I'd tell anyone going through something like this, not as advice, just as what I learned, is that the moment you decide to handle things with your mind instead of your emotions, is the moment everything shifts in your favor. Anger is useful for about 30 seconds. After that, it just costs you. Patience, documentation, the right people in your corner, those are the things that actually move the outcome. And what I found on the other side of all of it was not the life I'd had before. Restored. It was something genuinely better. Smaller in some ways. Quieter. A house I could actually take care of. Mornings that felt like mine. A woman sitting across from me who wasn't performing anything and didn't need me to either. That's not a consolation prize. That's what I should have been building toward all along. I'm 52 and I'm starting over, and I mean that without a single ounce of self-pity. The cost was real. The years were real. But so is this.